They know it's cheaper.
Welcome back to the Skid Factory, where it's Patrol time again. As you know, we're a bit of a fan of the Patrol as a modified four-wheel drive. Plentiful, good chassis, good suspension, everything works really well in these things except for the engine, especially in this case. This particular car has a ZD30 3-litre 4-cylinder in it, which are okay when they work, but a lot of the time they don't work because they have common failure points that make them either stop or blow up. In this case, this one's actually stopped because the VP44 injection pump has died, which is a common problem, not just on this engine, but on all the other engines that the VP44 was used on. So rather than fix this one, we've opted to change it over to a TD42, which if you check up here, you'll see we have rebuilt the TD42 engine already, and it is sitting on a stand ready to go in. Prior to that, we've got to obviously clean out the engine bay. We're getting rid of the transmission on this as well. This has got a automatic 4-speed in it, which is a pretty good thing, and I have actually fitted TD42s onto the front of them. It's a commonly done thing to just pull that engine out and put the TD42 straight onto the auto. But in this case, this is Gus's car, and Gus is 18 years old, and he wants to change his own gears, and that's cool too. So we have opted to do a manual swap at the same time as we put the TD42 in. So we've got to clean it all out, get rid of all the junk. I'm sure there'll be plenty of wires that aren't meant to be there. We'll get rid of all that as well, and clean house, ready to accept the TD42. Let's get stuck into it. How do you rate taking that dump pipe off on a scale of 1 to death?
Never again.
ZD30 is out and ready for marketplace. ZD30s aren't the worst engine in the world. They were really let down by both the management system that was on it and the fact that they were very easy to clog up with EGR and oil schmutz, which is still a thing with all modern diesels even today. So a lot of the problems of holding pistons and stuff like that they had was because the ports were so blocked up that there was no air getting to the cylinder, but there was a lot of fuel, which obviously turns into a bit of a blowtorch. So there's plenty of other things that go wrong with them, and as with this one, the injection pump has failed. So that's a VP44 Bosch pump, which is fitted to heaps of different engines, and guess what? They fail on all those engines as well. So it's easy to hate on ZDs, but I think the worst thing about them is they're just too small for that chassis. 3 litres isn't big enough for this, and I don't care whether it's a ZD30 or a 4JJ1 or a BMW M57 or an OM606, it's still not big enough for that car. It's a very big, heavy car, and you need a little bit of capacity to maintain that, sort of to get natural torque at all parts of the rev range without adding boost and whatnot. The common rail engines in the later models, which is probably about 2008 or 7, something like that, onwards till they finished in 15 or 16, they were an okay engine. They basically got rid of the injection system problems and new cylinder head and much more modern and proven common rail fuel injection system, so they work pretty well. Chappie uses them a lot and tunes them and has no problems with them, and they make reasonable power. So all's not lost with the ZD30, and you also can't put a TD42 in them because they're too new. So next up, we've got to do some trimming of things in the engine bay. The engine mount brackets that are welded to the chassis for a ZD30, they are in the wrong place for a TD42, and they're not really adaptable, so you really have to cut them off. And what we do is actually buy new brackets for a TD42 that are Nissan parts. We don't buy them from Nissan, but they're still a manufactured part, so you can then weld them onto the chassis where they're meant to be. The big catch with that is you don't know where they're meant to be until you put the gearbox and the engine in and dangle it all in place. And you're basically using your engine block as a jig to hold the thing in place, so you can then weld those mounts on. So it's a bit of a mess around, but it's the way to do it. I'm sure some people might have an actual jig to hold the things on there, but there's no sort of physical things to tell you where to put them. So the other bit that can catch people out is that there's more than one type of gearbox crossmember for the Patrol. They all look the same until you get right down and have a real close look at them. The automatic and manual ZD30 crossmembers are different. Neither of them are actually correct for the TD42 either, so there's just offset differences between them for the different lengths of the different trans, and there's just variances. So the rule of thumb is it's about 15 mil difference between them, so you can just re-drill holes in the crossmember, which is what we've done. I have done the TD42 conversion with those ZD crossmembers as well. It still fits, but one of them pulls the engine right back against the firewall. It doesn't touch, but it's much more further rearward. And the auto one, it pushes the engine a lot further forward, which can cause problems with your fans and your radiator hoses and that sort of thing. But they do both work, but they're just not ideal. So our next step is cutting off those mounts on the chassis, cleaning all that up. Then we're going to re-drill our crossmember to suit the offset. Then we've got to actually put the gearbox in, hold it in place, then put the engine in, and then move on from there. But before all of that stuff happens, we've got to finish putting the engine together. So let's do some work.
But you're going to write him up or something?
No. I didn't have to do it, so it's however bad of a job it is, it's still better than me doing it.
Perfect colour to soak up those oil leaks there, Gussie.
Oh yeah, it's not blending in this time.
It's worth noting that we had to replace anything aluminium that had any contact with water in this engine. And I say water literally because it would have never had coolant in it for a long time, that's for sure. The oil cooler housing, the front cover, and both thermostat housings were all rotted away. So you've got to kind of expect that on an ancient engine like this, but you can still get the stuff because people are breaking cranks and bailing out. So marketplace is your friend as usual. We've almost got it ready to go in the car, which is another whole big process in itself, which we'll get into shortly. But before we do that, we've got some shiny stuff to bolt on it, the stuff that's going to make the thing actually make power. We've left it all to last because we had to get the engine together anyway. To begin with, over here we've got the exhaust manifold. I was going to make an exhaust manifold for it because I've done that heaps of times just out of steam pipe and stuff. But I actually got in contact with Lindsay, who's sort of an old Subaru acquaintance from way back like 20 years ago or something. And Lindsay owns Tillix, which is like an aftermarket diesel company. And they make a whole bunch of products to suit old stuff like this, and also all the new common rail things that need certain modifications done to them. So, and he said, oh, we're actually in the middle of developing an exhaust manifold for the TD, so I managed to get a hold of one of those, and this thing is really nice. Like, it's way better than any other fabricated or cast manifold I've ever seen. They've put a lot of effort into this. Interestingly, it's T3 and true split pulse or twin entry, so you've got that sort of gasket on it. You can obviously use it on an open flange turbo as well, but if you wanted to, it is aimed at like people that want to get high power levels out of their TD, which is another thing in itself. We will not go there. But a lot of people do want to get big power out of the TD, so you want to run something like a whole set HX30 or something like that, or a 35. This twin scroll setup is the way to do it, and they've got a lot of detail in it, all the way down to the wastegate outlet here, which is actually divided properly right up to the seat of the wastegate, and they've even gone to the trouble of making a divided seat for a 38mm wastegate, which suits that flange. So that's pretty special, I reckon. So if you're after a really good quality TD manifold that's got all those features on it, this is probably the place to get it. In our case, we're just going to blank off that wastegate outlet, and you can get the blank plate as well, which we've got. There's another plate here, which I think may be just a weld on a different style of. Maybe it's just a weld on for you to put a different wastegate on it. I'm not sure about that. There's a bunch of other parts that they make as well, like just EGR blanks. I don't know whether we're going to need this or not. I don't think we will, but that's a tuning kit for your pump, injector pump. So that's one of the other things that Tillix specialises in, is old school VE pump tuning. So we've got springs, and we've got these pins which are able to be ground to suit different profiles. So that's all inside the injector pump. And I don't think we're going to have to go in there, but we've got it if we need it. Gussie can bolt that onto the engine now, and we'll go and have a look at the injector pump that we've had built. While I was chatting to Lindsay about TD42 stuff and talking about manifolds and turbos and whatnot, I did ask him who he would recommend to do a pump for me, as he makes pump parts and that sort of thing. And he recommended All States Diesel Injection Service in Townsville, otherwise known as JH Hilux, which is Josh. It's his like internet name from 2004 probably. Josh, Tim and Rad are the three fellas that I met up with when I went up to Townsville to see how this was done. And they showed me around the place and showed me what goes into not just building a pump, but calibrating it to suit the application. So this pump that he built for me, I did specify, obviously, fuel economy. That was a big thing for this engine, because Gus can't afford to pay for diesel that isn't being made into power. So soot out the exhaust is not a thing with this build. We don't want that. We want the diesel to make power, not soot. So no mutt for Gus, but he will have a heavier wallet. So what Josh has done for us is we've got an 11mm plunger, which is the same size as a factory TD42 turbo engine. So plunger size does definitely limit how much fuel you can deliver to the engine, but there's a lot more to it than that, a lot. So if we wanted to make more than, say, 180 horsepower, we probably would need to do a 12mm plunger, but we don't really want that. So 11mm it is. Go for the size that you want rather than a lot bigger. Like, if you're not going to use that fuel, there's no point having a pump with a 12mm plunger. But what's going on inside the pump here is there's a lot of very specific, basically calibration requirements. So you can bolt this pump together and you can have your plunger size and whatnot, and your appropriate delivery valves and whatever is the done thing. But if the pump isn't calibrated correctly afterwards, it's not going to work properly. There is specific things like the rack position. So in the diesel world, that's idle. Full throttle is called high idle. So you've got to set those positions correctly, because that is a very important thing inside the pump. So you don't go messing around with these screws and changing shit just because you think there's a screw there, I should mess around with it. It is something that has to be calibrated on a machine, which the machine costs, you know, $250,000 or whatever. So it is not something that you should be messing around with. There are things you can mess around with up in here with the boost compensator, but again, that's probably best left to someone like Chappie at Evolution, because you've got to know what you're doing with that as well. But one of the most interesting things I found was when they had it on the pump calibrator or dyno, or whatever you want to call it, was things like this here adjusts the amount of pressure inside the case of the pump. So there's a fuel pump, like a vane pump that sucks the fuel from the tank, pressurizes this case, and that needs to be at the correct pressure, because it helps to operate what's inside here, which is your timing advance, which it changes the timing of the injection system as the engine revs up and down. So it's directly connected. So there's kind of like, you've got to do it in a specific order, and then at some point you're going to have to make some compromises between that pressure and whether this movement is correct. So they have a little gauge on here that tells them how far it's advanced, and then they fiddle around with all these other screws and stuff. So I think it's important to understand that you can't just put a 12mm plunger in a pump and expect it to work, because it doesn't, and I've seen it many times. So best to go to the guys that have got a good reputation, and these guys definitely do, so highly recommended. Josh does some really cool and very nerdy injection pump videos on his Facebook page or Instagram, maybe, I don't know. So check that out if you're really into nerdy diesel stuff, because he goes right into it, and it is quite interesting if you can sort of get a handle of what he's talking about.
Yeah, we've fitted up the 77s, mate. Got the Aldor calibrated up. Level 13cc spread over 1,000. Great 77s, mate. Keep it up. Good stuff.
And we did have a few Miller chills as we calibrated some pumps.
I'm on the lemon squash. Yeah, got the Skid Factory boys here.
And it was a good time. Let's bolt this sucker on. We've got a few more other shiny bits to go on, and then we'll be almost ready to throw this into the car and weld some stuff. Knowing that TD42s have problems with crankshaft failure, it's always a good idea to replace the harmonic balancer, which is obviously very old in this case. You can put a new Nissan one on it, but Ross Performance Parts makes a balancer for these, and you can pretty much guarantee this is going to be a better quality product than the factory Nissan one. This is a good way of reducing the likelihood of your crank breaking, so it's money well spent. We just got to work out how to get it on there, because silly TDs have got a male thread on the crankshaft, unlike every other engine that ever lived.
You should know that book off by heart now, Gussie. You should have been doing some study. Kid, hold that torch nice and steady like.
Hold the flashlight. These are the original injectors that JH Hilux has reconditioned and modified to suit the pump output. There's not a lot to them, but still got to be done correctly. you've ever done a clutch on a Patrol, you'll know why I'm doing this. So my modified cross member wasn't quite modified enough. There is a bunch of different versions of this cross member, so you've got to be careful which one you use. Fortunately, we had Plotfy at the ready, and he had one stashed in his shipping container, so we've now got a manual trans cross member, and it's pulled the engine back a little bit more, so it's going to work.
So what's this one? ZD30 auto?
That's auto, yeah. So the internet told me that you could just go back 30 mil or whatever, which I did, but it still wasn't enough. But that whole cross member is the other way around. So it's got an offset and it's the opposite way around.
Did you just have that one on backwards?
You can't put it on backwards because these are in a different spot, but
Oh.
they must use the same pressings and everything and then change these around.
Remember that time we welded the Duramax one on backwards?
I didn't weld it on backwards, you did.
You told me to weld it on.
I might have tacked it on backwards. You welded it.
You come to lend your muscles, Geordie.
Yeah, my big muscles, eh? Definitely came at the right time.
Would you prefer a manual TD or an auto TD?
That's a hard choice. I'd probably go auto. Anything four-wheel drive, I go auto.
Until it's got no engine braking and you plummet down a hill, then you go, shit, I wish I had a manual.
Oh, and special guest Millsy arrives to help. Why does no one help me on?
Work's done.
No one helps me on my car. I got.
Doing anything. Now bring the gearbox back up a bit, Woody.
Yeah.
Yeah, just for angle. Bit more. Meant to face forward and have like a little spider or something in it, you know, protect it. I don't know.
So rain doesn't get in it when it's facing backwards.
Yeah, I like it. Solid idea.
Thought we'd give it a try with the engine brackets on there, but it's a bit tight, so just going to pull this one off for the moment.
But
There you go.
Good.
Good success.
for the win.
Engine is mated up to the trans. Trans is on the trans mount, so now we're working on getting the engine mount brackets onto the chassis. So these are actually genuine Nissan brackets. You can buy them still because people do dumb shit like this. So they fit pretty well. The only problem is, I've had this every time I've done it, is you put that mount on and sort of lay the engine over, and you've got to like kind of spread it. It doesn't want to meet up to the chassis quite perfectly, so we have to loosen everything off and then get underneath and push this mount before I tack it. So Gus has got to go underneath there and get sprayed with liquid metal shortly. Massive gains.
You got a Valvoline Spono, Gussie. You holding out on us, bros?
E-Valvoline.
What's going on here? Hook me up.
What he's forgotten is that he's wearing the hat that peeled my head open. It's probably still got bits of skull meat on it. Now that we've got the TD42 sitting in there as if it were from factory on its correct mounts, we can move on to plumbing everything up, adding the turbo, and sort of now we've got to explore all the differences between the two engine setups. There's a lot of things that are different, but there's also some things that are compatible, so it helps to know what you're up against. Cooling system wise, the radiator, we're actually going to use a ZD30 radiator. It is exactly the same as the TD42 radiator, apart from an extra bleed fitting that is on the top tank. And we're actually going to utilise that because I've drilled and tapped the back of the cylinder head to accept a fitting which has then got a coolant hose on it that is going to run forward and go into the top tank via that original outlet that's on the ZD30 radiator. This is a common modification done to 6-cylinder diesels like Cummins and that sort of thing. It's basically trying to stop there from getting like a steam trap in the back of the number 6 cylinder head, which obviously causes problems. So you get a little bypass. That coolant that's coming through there has already done its job. It's already taken the heat away. So bringing it back into the top of the radiator is no different from bringing it through here, except it's not having to travel all the way up the cylinder head to do so. So that's a very simple little trick that you can do. Obviously your engine's got to be out for that to happen, but it's pretty straightforward otherwise. Some other things that we're doing with the cooling system is the fan shroud is completely different between a ZD30. The 4-cylinder engine is very short, so it has a very deep fan shroud on it. So the way around this is just to buy a new fan shroud. I've bought a genuine Nissan TD42 fan shroud from just a Nissan parts specialist, and it drops straight onto that ZD30 radiator. The fan itself, there's heaps of different versions of ways to fix the problems that TD42s have. I think most of the overheating problems are due to the cylinder head being cracked, but fans, you can get better ones than what they have from factory. In this case, I've got a G35 or 350Z fan that bolts on straight onto the Nissan GU clutch, which is different to the GQ clutch, so you've got to be careful which one you buy. So that's pretty simple, it bolts straight on. There's other conversions that people do that have adapters that use I think it's a Pajero fan or something like that. There's heaps of different ones, but just shop around. Probably what's more important is to make sure that radiator is sealed up and that you're getting the maximum amount of air pulled through it. It's a very wide radiator, and that can, even though it's huge, it can be disadvantageous because the fan won't pull air through the side area if you don't seal up that shroud properly and if you don't seal the fan against the body. So a little bit of foam rubber and a little bit of time, and you basically doing your best for the cooling system. The hoses, you just buy TD42 hoses straight from your parts store, no dramas at all. In the heater hose department, these things have an incredibly ridiculously complex heater hose system for no particular reason. When they're a factory TD42 or 45, they go up there and up the top, and there's joiners and there's just things everywhere. You don't need any of that. I just grab a pair of these things, which is just a generic hose off some old Falcon or Commodore, straight hose with a 90-degree on the end, and they can then just go straight from there across the top of the exhaust manifold to your heater. Obviously, if you've got a top mount turbo, that's not going to work, but you shouldn't have a top mount turbo. It's a ridiculous idea. There's absolutely no reason for it, and all you're doing is causing yourself problems. So that's a simple fix there. We're pretty much ready to drop that in, slip all the bits and pieces of fan shroud in. These things are 2 pieces as well. They've got that little bottom section. That's so you can remove it easily. Don't leave that off, that is important. I'm not sure what these holes are for, but we'll work that out sometime. Time to bolt the bling on. We've got the turbo here. This is the same turbo as what I used on my old red TD42 Auto Patrol that we did. The only difference is we've put a V-band exhaust housing on this one. We're running at free float, so it's just going to make as much boost as it makes, which may not be a good idea on every turbo, but I ran this one on my red Patrol and I actually just blocked off the wastegate because it wouldn't make more than about 23 pound anyway. So we're just going to run it like that and see what happens. Being a diesel, it doesn't really matter how much boost you put into it, as long as you're not going so hard that the turbo's going to fail or you're superheating the air. But this is a GTX28 63 Garrett replica, Taiwanese made thing. I've got a few of them on the shelf, so we're going to use that. It works pretty good. Made 200 horsepower at the wheels on the other Patrol, so I'm sure it'll do the job for this. Very responsive and enough top end. 10 different TD42 dudes will tell you that there's a better turbo, and there might be, but at the end of the day, I've got this one, so it'll do. Let's bolt her on. We've got most of the engine and everything related to it all sort of buttoned up now, so we're at the point where we could probably think about trying to get it started. We've put oil in it and that sort of thing. A little bit of oil leaked out the bottom, but you get that when you don't put the turbo drain on properly. So what we need to do before that is just to wire the engine up. There's not much wiring on these things. There's only basically a 12 volt ignition wire that goes to the pump, and that's controls whether the engine will run or not. But there is other things like air conditioning and your alternator control and that sort of thing that has to be reconnected. So we've got the loom. Gus has partially stripped it, and I'm going to finish off just getting rid of anything that doesn't need to be there, which is quite a bit of stuff. And then we'll maybe add in a couple of extra things like some shielded wire to go from the tacho pickup, which is just picking up from the front of the camshaft sprocket, and we'll run that inside because we've then got to wire that into like a box that changes it from 6 pulse to 4, so it works with the tacho on the dash. But so once we've got all that done, it'll be ready to be able to try and crank the engine over. Obviously, we've got to circulate a lot of oil and get everything filled up. But before we do that, we really want to get the rest of the whole induction system complete, so we're not sucking in dirt out of the atmosphere. So intercooler is what we're going to work on first. There's a few ways you can go about intercoolers on these things. A lot of people use front mounts, which we have done as well. The disadvantage of a front mount is that you've got to run pipes through places that pipes don't really want to run through. The advantage of them is that they're very reliable and very effective out the front. Some other issues you might come across is putting a winch out the front, which a lot of four-wheel drives do have or need to have, and a big intercooler can be a problem with space in regards to that. Top mount is the other common option. There's factory top mounts, which I have one. We were going to use that, but then I sort of changed my mind halfway through. The project like this, they do tend to evolve, and you sort of sometimes change your mind on the way. So there's factory top mounts, and there's also aftermarket ones that are much bigger. Generally, they have to be fan forced because they don't work very good if you're close to stationary, as in low range, crawling up hills, that sort of thing, high engine speed, the intercooler doesn't really work that well in that regard. So that's another option. The third option is what we're going to go with, which is a water to air intercooler or a charge cooler. So it uses coolant to exchange heat from the compressed air from the turbo. The coolant that runs through here then exchanges the heat into the coolant. It then gets pumped out the front, and you have a radiator that then dissipates the heat. So these work excellent, and especially when you've got like very low vehicle speed and high engine speed, because it doesn't really matter whether you're moving or not. You fan force the radiator out the front, and it works very effectively when you're not moving. So sometimes people use low range switch as the trigger for fans forcing it, because it suggests that you're not moving very fast, or you're on the beach or whatever. So that's what we're going to go with. We've got this Plasma Man water to air core. This is off a previous project that we've had lying around for a long time, and I just happened to pull it down off the shelf, and it just fits really well. So it's a bit of a no-brainer. It might look small, but water to air intercooling is very efficient, so it doesn't need to have a giant core like this, like your traditional air to air. What you do need though is a big radiator, because the radiator is what's dissipating the heat out of the coolant that's being exchanged in here. So the radiator is, we use one of these on Mark's Fairlane, which also has a water to air intercooler on it now. It worked really well on that. These are just off eBay, and they're pretty cheap, $150 odd. So that's going to fit well in the front there. The last thing I do need to make is just bolts onto the top of the inlet manifold. You can see I've cut that plate out of just a chunk of 5/8 aluminium bar. Obviously drilled the holes in it, put the center hole in it, and I've got a couple of 1/16 NPT ports in there. One of them is going to go to the boost compensator, and the other one's going to go to the boost gauge for the inside of the car. So I'll weld that up, and then we'll start thinking about getting this mounted onto the top of the engine there. That has its own difficulties sometimes with these TD42s. They don't have many bolt holes or anything on the cylinder head for you to actually mount things on, so it can be a bit of a challenge, but I've got a few ideas, and having done it many times before, I can figure something out. And the other thing we've got to mount obviously is the radiator out the front. There's plenty of room for it, but I do want it to be right up against this air conditioning, so we're going to trim away this, remove that bottom half of it, slip the radiator in, and then remake a new version of that. That has to be there because it is holding the bonnet catch, so you need that strength. So Gussie's going to get stuck in and zip that off through that line. I'll weld up this piece here, and we'll get stuck into some intercooling. completed all the wiring. I basically just stripped out things that didn't need to be there anymore. There's not really that much, and if you're not really experienced in wiring, you probably don't need to do it. Just leave it. It'll just tape it up and make sure it doesn't get caught up in the fan or something. But it's basically just a few little bits of ZD30 wiring left over. The wiring fits pretty well as it is. Don't really need to modify lengths or anything like that, so it's fairly straightforward. All I've added is just this is tacho, and that is pump power, so basically your on switch and your off switch. Following that, we've done all the intercooler piping as far as the air path for the intercooler and also the intake to the turbo. This has got an aftermarket airbox in it, which is a good idea in a Patrol, along with a lot of other four-wheel drives. The factory box does not seal very well, and it's plastic. It's got some little clips on it. Half the time, half the clips are missing, and getting dirt into any engine, but specifically a car like this that is going to operate on dirt roads a fair bit, that dirt will kill your turbo and your engine really quickly. So a good airbox is a good idea. It's got a 4-inch snorkel just so Gus can show off to his mates, and also drive through, I don't know, a dam or something. Don't do that. Now all we've got to do is get diesel into the engine. But before we do that, we're going to crank the engine and get oil pressure. This is a very big engine. It's been completely dry of oil. It's got 2 massive oil filters on it. So you do need to spend a bit of time getting the oil circulating and getting some oil pressure, probably 20 or 30 pound is probably all we can really hope for on cranking. But it's a good idea to do that before you start trying to start the engine, because if you start it and then there's no oil pressure, that's when the damage is going to occur. So we'll start by cranking the engine over. We've got a master gauge on it. If you've got a light, that light is fine as well. If the light goes out, you're usually pretty sweet. But in this case, we're using an aftermarket gauge set. So I've got a transponder or transducer type sender in it. So we've pulled that out and just put a master gauge in it so we can just physically keep an eye on it. Following that, we will power up the pump, which is just this one wire. I've got to wire this in underneath the dash, but for the moment we're just going to plug it into the fuse box and it will power the pump up. So that's our on-off switch. And then we'll bleed the injectors and it should just fire up. Fingers crossed. No need for a laptop in this case, and no need for a screwdriver for your carburetor either. Bleeding the injectors is simply a matter of cracking them at the injector. All that does is allow the pipe to purge through, and then pressure can build up. If there's any air in there, it won't be able to build up pressure and it won't crack the injector spring. So it's pretty straightforward. You can just crack them all and then just crank the engine over with the pump on, and they will just spit out a bit and then just shut them all off, and it will probably start up. And it might be a bit rough, but it'll bleed out pretty quickly after it starts up. If you get one, you can then crack each cylinder as it's running, and you'll hear if that cylinder is not running properly. It's kind of like pulling a spark plug lead off. Just hot wiring it to a spare fuse box point here.
Probably put some water in, eh?
Yes, great success. This is a bit easier with a funnel bucket, even though Gus hasn't actually fitted it properly, but it's still working. So all you do is just take off the top hose off the heater here. You want to purge that heater out because it's going to trap air. So we've got coolant coming out of the hose, and we've got coolant in this hose. So that's all you can really ask for. Now we can run it up.
Get it on the chip.
The alternator even works
I had to pay extra for that because it was nearly new. Well, that was a fairly reasonable first start, I would have thought. What do you reckon?
Yeah, it's so sick.
We did get stitched up by not realising that there's no outlet on this radiator cap here. Just had a blanking cap on it, but we'll work that out via young, new Luke,
Why don't you just tap it?
the radiator shop. Yeah, maybe.
Why don't you just use that thing? Why don't you just leave this on? Why don't you use that?
Well,
You
that's
don't
the other
like it.
option, is to leave that there, which I have done before as well, but I was just trying to tuck the engine bay for Gus. Keep it clean, brah.
Let man talk.
Let a man talk. Anyway, we've got a fair bit of work still to do. Obviously, there's a whole bunch of... Well, there's actually a fair bit of stuff missing because I haven't got a power steering pump yet, and the air conditioning compressor was seized, so I've got to get a new one of those as well. We'll have to fabricate something, a tank for this, the water to air, just as a reservoir tank. I think I plan on putting it up here because there's available space there. That's the thing with four-wheel drives, you do end up with a space deficit. We're going to put a second battery over there, which is a good spot for it, so I've got a tray coming for that. So your space gets eaten up pretty quickly, so you've got to look for wherever you can to fit things. So if it's not intercooler pipes running through the front, it's water to air hoses and reservoirs and whatnot. So there's a place for everything, hopefully, so we'll get stuck into that. But I reckon that's all for now. We've had a pretty big episode, I would have thought. Woody, is that right?
I don't know. You've been filming. I've been working on my own car.
Feels like we've done a fair bit of work. I don't know. What about you, Gus?
Yeah, two weeks worth, almost.
Gus is on school holidays, so we're just trying to get as much done as we can while he's not at school, so he can see how the thing works. So it's been good, been fun. We'll keep going and get stuck into all those little bits, like there's no throttle cable. That's another thing you got to know about when you've got a ZD30. They have a drive-by-wire throttle, so you've got to convert the throttle into a cable. I think we did that on the Cummins anyway, so there's bound to be some history there. I'm sure I'll work it out. Thanks to all the people that have helped us along the way, particularly Lindsay from Tillix and Josh and the crew from JH Hilux. They have been invaluable, and I've learned a lot off those guys. So just because I'm old and cranky doesn't mean I know everything. It's good to check out how the pump works and see Lindsay's creative products. So that was fun. Let's keep working and get this thing on the road. We've got plenty more stuff to bolt onto it. Lots of suspension bits from Dobinson's for a start. We've got a locker, Harrop E-locker front diff to go in it, and we've got a bunch of gauges, a little sort of a gauge system, a multi-gauge, so you can monitor all your diesel things without having a bank of gauges that looks like you're a 1995 Sylvia. Which the long arm of the law loves to pick on. So heaps of stuff to do. We'll get stuck into that next episode. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.
Sit, Roger.
Get off! You're tied to! Get off, Rog! Get off me! Go get in!
Do what I want.
Kill
Do
him!
what I want.
What? What? What?
In the sack and the mouth. Come here, Roger. Come here. Come here. Oh, come. Oh, he's comfy.
You're making it worse!
He's comfy.
Good boy, Rojo.
Oh, at least someone loves me, Roger.
Moral support.
I've bought a manual swap kit that's sitting under the bench, so we need to. Oh my god.
Right. What?
Batteries.
So it's 3 out of 4.
Turn it off and on.
They like the bloopers.
Right, upper.